Okay, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with the event. I'd like to start by welcoming you all to this final HFA Speaks event of this year. It is mental health and its connection to the arts in light of National Mental Health Awareness Month. My name is Faith Harvey. I'm a web and social media intern for the Division of Humanities and Fine Arts here at UCSB, and I'm very excited to be moderating today's event. HFA Speaks is an event that the division hosts every quarter where we invite UCSB faculty to talk about any specific topic. So thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. And as a heads up, as you heard just now, the Zoom meeting will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to leave them in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end of the panel. Without further ado, I'd like to start by welcoming our panelists. First up, we have Ellen O'Connell Whittet. Ellen O'Connell Whittet is a continuing lecturer here in the writing program at UCSB and is the author of What You Become in Flight. It is her memoir exploring her upbringing with ballet, what it took to move beyond the stage lights after an injury kept her from dancing, and the reflections of the dark perfectionism that may come with pursuing our dreams. Thank you for being here with us today, Professor O'Connell Whittet.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next, I'd like to welcome Breana Gilcher. Breana Gilcher is a lecturer in the music department here at UCSB, and she's also a board-certified music therapist in Los Angeles. She has provided care for children with developmental disabilities as well as the elderly. Thank you also for being here with us today, Breana.
Happy to be here.
So I would definitely like to start out with the event with some questions that we have prepared. First, I'd like to ask you, Professor O'Connell Whittet, about your memoir. So how has writing your memoir intersected with mental health?
Do you mean in terms of my own mental health or how I thought about mental health while I was writing it?
I suppose with your mental health, I feel like those two kind of go hand in hand, like I know your memoir deals a lot about your past with mental health in the dance world and things like that. So how did you take your own personal experiences and apply them to the memoir?
Yeah, so I wrote about being raised in a pretty intensive culture of ballet and perfectionism and the sort of social conditioning that ballet brought me up in. I danced from the age of 6 until I was about 22. And yeah, there was a lot in my memoir about the harder parts of that, including, being raised in a really competitive environment, in an environment where you're always looking at your own body in the mirror and comparing it to everyone else's bodies in the mirror. Just how hard you have to work for absolutely no guarantee that you'll ever get anywhere professionally. So I wrote a lot about the toll that took on me, especially in my adolescence, the extremes I would go to, be the best dancer in the room as much as I could. So I would say it was something that I had to go to a lot of therapy for before I could write about it. Like I had to have narrative distance from the subject in order to see it clearly and see the culture clearly. I think sometimes when we are still in the midst of mental health struggles, it can be really hard to recognize exactly how you're suffering or how what your triggers are, the kinds of things that probably reinforce a lot of our ideas of self-worth. So I had to have narrative distance. I couldn't have really started writing that book until I, had processed a lot of those kinds of things. And I think in the writing of it too, there was a lot of, I mean, I'm sort of resistant to the idea of writing as catharsis because I think that there's a craft to it. And it's, it's hard work. It's not diary entries. And I put years of work into that book, but there is a kind of catharsis that happens when you're able to see and recognize and shape your own experience. It gives you a sense of agency, I think, over your healing. And I felt like that, like there were a lot of things that I was able to leave on the page. Like I felt like I had fully mined them for whatever metaphor and narrative purposes I needed them for. And I don't feel like I carry those with me in a way that I don't know. I don't know that I would have been able to leave those behind in the same way had I not written the book.
Absolutely. I think that is such an important way to look at it, and writing being cathartic, but also it is a craft and it's something you're constantly working at. So I think that actually transitions well into my question that I had for Professor Gilcher. With your profession in music therapy, I would really love to know more of that. So could you please describe your experience using music for therapeutic reasons in hospice and also with children with developmental disabilities?
I'd love to start by just giving a brief description of what music therapy is. Music therapy is a research-based profession that uses research-based interventions that utilize music, but are aiming to achieve a therapeutic non-music related goal. So the goal is not to make music or even play an instrument necessarily. The goals are going to be related to whatever that particular person is going through. So, for example, in my work in hospice, a lot of the goals of the music interventions were alleviating pain symptoms, decreasing anxiety, grief counseling, facilitating bonding between caregivers and patients, and that kind of thing. So it often looks like you're having a sort of music jam, but in the background, all of these techniques are specifically geared to target specific goals. And then with children with developmental disabilities, I worked briefly at a place in Tallahassee, Florida called Progressive Pediatrics. And this whole facility is geared towards assisting children with developmental disabilities. And the kinds of goals there were, helping with simple things like sharing, taking turns, social skills, all of those things utilizing music. So, early on in my study, I got very interested in the effects of music on the brain, particularly with Alzheimer's and dementia. And that's something that I pursued sort of throughout my degree and then beyond. And I would see some really kind of incredible outcomes in my sessions with patients. There's an area of our brain called the premedial frontal cortex, which is deep inside our brain. And not autism, Alzheimer's atrophies the brain from the outside in. So this premedial frontal cortex stays intact for a long time. The reason why that's great for us as music therapists is this is the part in the brain where music and memory meet. So in my sessions with older patients, I would often have, we would sing every single verse of Amazing Grace together. But this patient couldn't necessarily tell me what they had for breakfast that morning, or maybe even not even their name. So music therapy is a really powerful tool to go in and support honestly whatever else is going on. It kind of takes whatever interventions are already being used and increases the efficacy of them. One last example that I'll share is oftentimes if someone has a stroke, they might receive music therapy as an addition to their physical therapy because we have music interventions that use rhythm that really, really help to increase recovery and healing times as people are regaining mobility.
That's so incredible. I really love hearing that science is, showing us that things like music and singing and playing instruments can be a very healing thing in itself. I think that's super important. So I wanted to kind of shift over to you both on the campus and what it's like kind of seeing students day in and day out. And over the years that both of you have been teaching, have you noticed changes in students and what they've been going through? Professor O'Connell Whittet, I would like to start with you if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, certainly, and especially in the last 3 years. I've taught at UCSB since 2011, with a little break in there, but I think that we have a much more robust framework to support students who are, struggling in all sorts of ways. I think that we get better training on it as faculty. I think that we're just, destigmatizing conversations in the classroom, assigning readings that are probably more relevant to students who are struggling. But, I certainly saw during the pandemic a fairly major dip in students' wellness, mental wellness, and faculties and staffs as well. I mean, it was everywhere. Nobody was having an easy time. And one of the most powerful things I've been a part of in my, I guess at this point, 12 years with a 2-year break, so decade at UCSB, as I directed a program last year called Pandemic Initiatives, where students were able to write about their experiences. And I know that somebody here, Deborah Harris, was really instrumental in getting that program off the ground. So wanted to shout out Dr. Harris for that. But yeah, students were able to write about their experiences in the pandemic. And I think that there was something about combining a little bit of, sort of what Professor Gilcher is saying, combining real struggles, lapses in memory, lapses in wellness, suicidal ideation, all sorts of really tough things with the arts, with like a structured, supportive environment. In some ways, I think was really healing for them. To me, it opened up a lot more questions about how to create supportive frameworks for students in classrooms who are undertaking that kind of writing, how to evaluate that kind of writing, how to encourage students without, pushing them to write about things that they maybe aren't ready to write about, because this was in 2022. It was still a very ongoing situation. And I learned so much from the students about what they had overcome, which I think was really useful just for my own classroom teaching, like knowing when students were turning their cameras off in their Zoom rooms, it was because they were sharing a room with like 2 other siblings who were also, trying to go to remote school, or helping their parents navigate the unemployment benefits, website, and their parents didn't speak English. That was one of the examples. So, very real traumas that are put down on paper, given these constraints, word count, due dates, a series of conventions that we think about when we are writing creative nonfiction. It has to be truthful, but it has to be scene-based. It has to be narrative. It has to have some kind of transformation by the end. Was just really a moving experience to lead. And a lot of those students ended up actually applying to MFA programs afterwards. Like, I think they were so galvanized by the agency that they got from writing down very, very difficult experiences, that a lot of them have gone on to write, in academic contexts and professional contexts, and have told me, actually just this weekend, I received a really kind note from one of those students who's just starting a fully funded MFA program. And she said she'd never considered writing before, but just loved it. And anyway, I just am so moved by students' own ability to find that in themselves. There was so little teaching that happened and so much peer support, their own sort of digging deep to find answers to, their own questions about why they had to suffer and who didn't have to suffer as much. And yeah, it was really striking that was just part of our, community, sort of community processing of COVID.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in writing in particular, and especially with nonfiction writing, you have to really tell your story, and also having it to fit in a rubric can be a little difficult. So I'm really happy to hear that your students were able to put themselves in their own story and kind of be transformative in itself. Professor Gilcher, I would like to know if you noticed any change in your students through music teaching on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to echo what Professor O'Connell Whittet, sorry, is saying, there was a big a big drop in students, all of our mental well-beings during the pandemic, and it showed up, I think, in ways that were kind of unexpected for us artistically. I think there's a lot of romanticized ideas about how we create through struggle, and these like incredible works are born out of these most difficult moments, and yet a lot of us found ourselves in this place and really lacking a lot of purpose and momentum and meaning, and there was a lot of sort of questioning, why are we doing this, what is the real purpose of it for. And I think there was an important lesson to be learned in that, which is a certain grace given to one's own artistic process and how it ebbs and flows, and that is actually normal. We're not supposed to be just creating all the time constantly. And one of the things that I have noticed as we have trickled back to being together again is a renewed sense of appreciation, especially in the music community, for being able to meet in person, for being able to hear my students' sounds in the same room that I'm also in, to being able to, share our first chamber recitals and big ensemble concerts back. We're all just really, really potent and meaningful, and sort of, I think, really reminded all of us. Why we're doing this, and the connection being the largest part of why we do it, especially musicians playing together. That's We're meant to do it together, so much more so than in our own practice rooms. And I think there was a really renewed um, appreciation for that.
Yeah, I think something you mentioned in your response was about the idea of constantly having to be like at the grindstone, like perfecting your craft, like doing this. And I think that is something that gets put into college students' minds very often. We have all these classes and there's these deadlines to meet. And I was wondering if, from a teaching perspective, if either of you have dealt with burnout, which I feel like is such a more mainstream kind of word now. I feel like we hear it all the time, which is just, excessively working and feeling so tired from it. So I was wondering if, as teachers and in your personal life, if you have dealt with burnout before. Professor O'Connell Whittet, we can start with you.
Yeah, certainly. I definitely felt burnout while teaching during the pandemic. I also had my first child very early on in May 2020, and was trying to keep her healthy, teach online, living through the fear, trying to figure out like how to even conduct classes or, create course material for a completely new mode of learning, new to me anyway. And it was really difficult to do my own writing or my own research, or even think about like what I still cared about that wasn't just trying to get to the end of every day. And then in writing, I teach a lot of creative nonfiction, and students who write a lot, especially, and who are not just taking one class for the requirement, but who sign up for these classes over and over again, I think often struggle with not knowing what to write about. They feel like they've really reached the bottom of the experiences that they think they have, and get writer's block, start writing something, don't exactly know where it's going. And I would, I always tell them that those fallow periods in your life are really important, that those are, we have those in nature. We certainly need them in our lives, and we don't live in a society or university, academic setting that supports fallow periods, or, trying to sort of regenerate, regrow, after feeling like you just have plumbed the depths of your own experiences. I'm teaching a class actually in the fall in College of Creative Studies, Writing and Lit, called How to Do Nothing. That's about this. It's about doing nothing and trying to resist. It's based on the Jenny Odell book of the same title, How to Do Nothing, but how to resist what she calls the attention economy. And she says there's something like there's nothing harder to do than nothing. And yet I think when we do nothing, that's when we reach like the most tedious parts of our day, when we put our phones down or forget our phones, or have a really moving experience listening to music and not doing anything else, or looking at art and not doing anything else, that sometimes you have ideas or remember something, or feel inspired in ways that you would never have had access to had you been trying to produce something. So I think, doing nothing can be a useful exercise in doing something, but also I think it's a way to kind of reset your brain and try to resist this constant urge to produce, because producing and producing and producing is not going to make good art, and also, like, not all art has to be good. Like, we should be allowed to make bad art. I think that that's really important, actually, to working artists, that we have that space to do that, and that we not just be trying to churn out masterpieces and A papers, because that's not realistic. And unfortunately, in the quarter system, and with the pressure of trying to graduate in 4 years and not ruin your GPA, it's really hard to get that message through. So that's why I'm actually trying to create a class around doing nothing. And one thing I really like about teaching in CCS is they assign units based on how much you do. So I was kind of joking the other day, as I was creating this course description for their website, like, the more nothing you do, the more units you get, and, like, it's so rare that we get that opportunity, but I wish there were more in the university to not worry about production all the time.
It is absolutely rare to get the opportunity to do nothing. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Professor Gilcher, did you have anything to speak to about burnout and being a teacher?
Sure, I've definitely experienced burnout myself as a teacher, as a performer. I think we all experienced a pretty hefty burnout during the pandemic. And I got actually a lot better at doing nothing during the pandemic, and it's something that I've lost since then in the pressure and the craziness to come back. And I think that has a lot to do with burnout. I would love to take this class. It sounds really great. But yeah, I think that it's something that we all tend to struggle with, and giving ourselves the grace to like let the foot off the gas is so important. During the pandemic, I practiced my instrument less than I've probably ever played it in my life, and it it felt really necessary. Like it felt, I can't totally describe why, but there were, I sort of just realized that there were real reasons why I didn't want to pick it up, and that was okay. And since then, I am a lot less attached to this idea that like I need to be constantly playing, constantly practicing. Um, and I have like a lot more balanced relationship with it, which I think especially as college students is hard to manage, because in college as a music student you're told, all right, this is your time where you're going to put in all your hours, and we're asking students to practice at times 4 hours a day, and finding places where that can ebb and flow, I think is really important. Again, speaking to this sort of cyclical nature of everything, it has to be included in the way that we practice our art too.
And what is your instrument?
My instrument is the oboe, so I am the
Okay.
oboe professor here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's actually perfect, because what I find so fascinating about you both is you're a professor in your art, but you also do your art for passion on, every day. So how do you both kind of separate your work from your passion? And do you separate it to combat burnout, or to keep the love for the art? Professor Gilcher, we can continue with you. So yeah, how do you kind of keep the separation of the two?
I mean, it's very hard, and it changes depending on the priorities. If I have a lot of work that's asking me to learn a lot of music, then sort of inevitably my own musical projects get kind of pushed to the side. Um, and that's a balance that I'm still working on. But I think that having an art practice is an extension of our humanity, and that is the main reason why I try to keep them at least somewhat disconnected. I try to make sure that I have things that are for me, because the process of making art is innately good for our mental health. It innately helps us process, helps us express, helps us filter emotions, and reflect. And in an age where we're all really encouraged to commodify every single hobby, it can be really hard to have an outlet that's truly just an outlet. And this is something that I'm always working on myself, and I'm always asking my students to work on, because I think in order to have a creative career that is fulfilling, you have to be honoring your own projects. You have to be working on your own stuff just as much as you're working on the stuff for other people. I think it's a really important part of the happiness to this career. And the musicians that and teachers that I see, predominantly musicians who have spent their lives playing only a certain type of music, I see a lot more bitterness in those careers than careers where people have also done a lot of their own work.
Yeah, I echo everything you're saying and recognize so much of that from my own practice. You know, you both, Breana and I, are so lucky to have teaching jobs as artists, because that's sort of the golden ticket. And I do think of myself primarily as a writer, even though that's never what's been the thing that pays the bills or the way I spend most of my time. It's always been teaching. And I love teaching, and I feel incredibly lucky to do it. But teaching does take up as much time as you give it. You know, there's sort of this sponge effect where, the more time you have, the more time teaching takes up somehow. So I agree that, you have to be really protective of your artistic time. And I really have to prioritize that. And especially, in an era of my life when I have a young child and I'm going to have another one quite soon, it's really easy, I think, to put my art last, because it doesn't pay the bills. It's not the thing screaming at me, for dinner. And yet it's the thing that I've felt since I was a kid, compulsively um, called to do. So for me, I've tried over the course of my teaching career to not see them all as so separate. I used to have like writing time, and it was like my passion projects and my memoir that I was working on. And then I would have teaching, and then I would have like the kind of writing that you have to do, when you teach at a university, the research that you have to do. And I've tried more and more and more to see those things as connected and complementary to each other, and to understand how there's a whole language that exists in the university to talk about artistic pursuits, like in a language that I think my colleagues use and understand, so that I don't have to just sort of ignore that I do that or do that secretly, but can actually foreground that when I list my research out for, various whatever kinds of reviews I have to go through. So that's helpful. The research that I've been doing around especially writing and trauma, also I think only complements the creative practice that I have. But I try to do something related to my writing, um, if not every day. As Breana was saying, like there are some weeks when you have a lot of grading, or it's just not feasible. But I try to do something as often as possible, even if it's just half an hour of reading or research, or writing 300 words, or just something small. So it's definitely a struggle, but there are a lot of artists on campus who are teaching and who are juggling a lot of balls and research and students and families and all sorts of things. So you just make it work, because it's the thing that we're called to do.
Right. And I think that kind of ties into the idea you brought up earlier about doing nothing. and how there's kind of like a guilt sometimes when you aren't doing anything and you're like, well, I could be doing, something that's paying the bills, but then I also want to do my creative like outlet, so I think there's a lot of things that kind of fall into that. And with that, what advice would either of you give to young creatives who maybe feel like they want to give more time to their passion, whether that be music or writing or whatever they have, but maybe feel like they just don't have the time or they're stressing themselves out about other things? We can start with you, Professor O'Connell Whittet.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of students who apply to MFA programs and ask me for advice around those or letters of recommendation. Especially, I would say CCS students tend to go that route, but I have plenty of writing program students who go that route. And something like an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts degree, can be a really helpful way to have some structure around that so that it institutionalizes and legitimizes your artistic practice. There are also a lot of pitfalls. So I never have a blanket like yes or no for studying this in grad school kind of answer, because it depends on so many factors, including financial factors and time factors and just other responsibilities in your life. It's a major question that I think people can only really answer for themselves. But I think that artists, writers, musicians, dancers, pairs, they can't be stopped. That's sort of the thing that makes them the artist, is that they have this drive to do it. And I always think that it's the rest of my life that I have to figure out how to, my teaching will always be the thing that I prioritize in my career, because that's my job. That's, like I said earlier, the thing that pays the bills, but it's also like, I'm never going to leave my students hanging. I feel a responsibility to them. I have like relationships with students that I've had decades ago and that I am, still in touch with, and who I now think of as sort of peers in the field. But you have this drive, and you can't not write or, play the oboe or whatever it is that you do, sculpt. So I would just tell students, like, they just have to be very protective of that time. They, in this country, in our culture, we don't have a lot of funding. We don't have a lot of support if we're not being productive. We see value as production and as money making. So we have to be really protective, I think, of our time and of our energy around creation.
And how about you, Professor Gilcher? Do you have any advice you'd give to young creatives?
I think that this is, like we're saying, a really multifaceted question that has a different answer for everyone. And I think, maybe trying to identify what those factors, what those barriers are for yourself. Is it a time barrier? If it is a time barrier, why does that exist? Is it because of something that's in your control or something that's out of your control? So a combination of like identifying the barriers that are within your control and the ones that aren't, and having again some self-kindness for whatever that situation looks like. And then I think the hardest part about it is that we have to do one of the hardest things, which is choose ourselves over all of the other demands and responsibilities and things that are being asked of us. And that's something that's very hard to do in or outside of an artistic practice. But I think one of the really beautiful things about being an artist is that we have this means of connecting with ourselves that we can use as a means to choose ourselves. And it's a hard thing, but it's an important thing that I think is really really crucial.
It's so refreshing to hear professors say to choose yourselves and follow your passion, because I feel like it's not something we're, being pushed to do all the time, especially in academia. So I definitely appreciate those answers. Kind of to wrap up the questions that we prepared for you both, is there anything that either of you have incorporated into your courses that you would consider to be therapeutic or healing in nature? I know you guys kind of touched on it briefly, but maybe you have a favorite assignment you give your students. We'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I ask students to write about themselves and their experiences constantly, and I always think something, even when I teach a class that has exclusively research-based writing, I ask students to think about their own identities, um, their own interests and excitement, and to find the heat on the page, whatever it is that lights them up, because I think they have to have some buy-in, in order to, you know, to want to write about something and to spend time with that subject for several weeks. So I certainly ask students over and over again to return to their own lived experiences, because I think that that's, that's often overlooked as material for academic coursework. And yet, I don't know how to write personally. I don't know how to write about something that I don't feel like is really about me, in some way.
Absolutely. And how about you, Professor Gilcher, in the music department?
With my students, we do a lot of improvisation, which is a pretty unusual thing for most classical musicians to do. We sort of grow up playing music that has been put on a page, and we're taught all of these ways to play it in very accurate and precise ways. And in my own sort of creative journey process, I discovered improvisation and really, I think, opened up a whole new world for myself artistically. And I think that it's the first tool that any musician can begin to utilize, where you start meeting yourself in your instrument. It's playing the music that you hear in your head. So you have to get quiet and listen. And again, this is very challenging for most classical musicians who are told what to play and when to play it. And I think a large part of making, especially that type of artistic medium where you're sort of channeling someone else's thing, I think it's really important to also know how to channel your own artistry, your own spirit, and um, improvising also makes your classical playing not quite so in a box. It really encourages you to maximize every single aspect of your instrument that you can, so that you can say anything that you want to say. So my goal for my students as improvisers is that they can sit down, meet their own sounds, and effectively and meaningfully for themselves communicate an aspect of themselves or an emotional experience or an idea. And I think that makes a really big difference. I also encourage my students to listen to a lot of different types of music, as many as possible. I also think I think that the music that you like is totally valid, and the music that is like, there's no wrong music to listen to, which is an idea I also really try to emphasize. And then also, especially given the abstract nature of music and sound, I really encourage my students to look at other artistic mediums for both inspiration as well as their own creative outlet. And I think all these things just help make us a little bit more well-rounded.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for sharing what you do in your classrooms. And it's time to turn it over to the audience if they have any questions. And we already got one sent in, so I'll go ahead and start with that one. The question reads, how we've heard about art as therapy, but this person wants to know, what do you think about the notion that some films or literature put forward that one needs to be an emotional pain to produce great art? And do you believe that? Either of you can start if you have an answer.
I mean, I have an answer to that. Yeah, we do have a romanticized idea of starving, struggling artists. You certainly don't need to be an emotional pain to write. And in fact, I think sometimes that can be a really hard place to create from, because your focus and your energy is divided between survival and, producing out of that. I think people are probably drawn to art because they're in emotional pain and it's a way to express and explore. Also like people struggle and are starving artists because there's not a lot of money in arts. And I was going to say, this is actually, to me, that particular stereotype seems dated, because now I think, because there's no money in so many different kinds of arts, there's no funding and like governmental support, institutional support, that a lot of artists have to be wealthy actually in order to create good art. One of the things I was thinking of earlier, and I was listening to Breana talk, is that I'm so glad to have a day job. Like, to me, knowing exactly how much my next paycheck is going to be and what day it's going to come frees me up to be more creative. I think that if I were worried about survival, I wouldn't have the mental space and energy and time to, devote to art. So I always sort of reject that. I mean, I think that we have to turn to our emotional experiences in order to create depth and richness and vividness in our art, but I don't think you have to be in constant turmoil. And I think that people in constant turmoil probably can get something out of art.
I would completely agree with all of that. I do think it's a pretty romanticized idea. I recently read a biography of Beethoven, and it really seems like some of these ideas go all the way back to him as like the starving artist genius that is super emotional and constantly caught up in this like storm, and that's what's fueling all of their art. Really, just like Ellen is saying, it can actually be a detriment. And oftentimes, you need to be resting and healing and conserving rather than expending and creating. Um, I would also add that I think it takes just as much creativity to build a career as an artist as to be an artist. And having that perspective is something that has really helped illuminated my choices in terms of career. Like, you get to design your life and how the pieces of your career work together with just as much sort of innovation as you put into your own art, and it's necessary for a fulfilling artistic career.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have another question here, kind of leaning towards the profession of being a professor here at UCSB. So they're asking, how do you handle it when you're in contact with a student who's clearly struggling with mental health difficulties in school? And how do you kind of toe the line, I think, between being a professor and being, kind of removed from that, and also wanting to help out human to human? Professor O'Connell Whittet, if you wanted to lead off with that, you can go right ahead.
Yeah, I have a ton of resources in my syllabus and I'm always adding to them. Like, if you're experiencing this particular hardship, here are something that your tuition's already covering. And one of those things is mental health treatment at UCSB, which I know, and I know it has, there's a lot to be desired in how fast people can get in, and they get sort of farmed out to other, therapists in the community as a model. But, I've had students come to office hours and cry about whatever they're going through for years. And, on the one hand, I think it's really an honor when somebody feels like we are people they can be vulnerable in front of. And I don't know if it's because they're writing about their personal experiences or just because they feel like, I don't know, somehow safe in the classroom or something, that they come to us with these things when they do. Um, I've seen it all. I've seen all sorts of tears and breakdowns in my office, and I'm very aware that I don't have the training to respond to it the way somebody who, like, is a licensed therapist would. So I I would listen to them like a kind human would. And I would also, I mean, I often am trying to walk them to CAPS or wherever, people have the training to respond. I think, we can be friendly, we can be supportive. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that our students are living full lives. And sometimes those lives are really difficult, and especially recently. And I often say to my students that I know there are some quarters where you really just can't prioritize school. Like you're prioritizing working a bunch of jobs in order to pay your rent, or you're prioritizing some crisis that's going on in your life. And communicating with us around that to the extent that you feel comfortable doing that is helpful, I think, for your professors, at least the nice ones, to have a fuller sense of how we're evaluating you and what is not really fair to ask of you. But can be really hard because we also are on the hook for evaluating their work and submitting grades, and without enough data to assess, it's really hard to do that. So there are a lot of things that I'm balancing and weighing. But I think, we can always be kinder and more understanding. I am amazed at how much our students are just constantly dealing with.
Yeah, I would agree. I think oftentimes the best thing you can do is listen. And I definitely experience this a lot as well, especially in the one-on-one nature of what I do. I'm largely meeting with students one-on-one, and so their lives are included, and their lives are affecting their art and their work and everything. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I also put the mental health resources in the syllabus, and I'm, uh, ready and quick to um, recommend those when necessary. I also think, kindness, supportiveness, encouragement is a really helpful and important thing, and students are already doing a really hard thing, especially cultivating an artistic medium for your career. And art has you meeting yourself constantly, so it's gonna come up and it's gonna be a part of it. And I think it's very important to have personal boundaries within, not trying to give advice or therapy or tell students what to do, but are trying to like be there for them and help them find solutions in as much as they're willing to share, and I think that it's a thing that I hold with a lot of care, the fact that students feel sometimes comfortable sharing these things with me, and so it's something I really try to take good care of. I think it's an important responsibility as a teacher when the reality is that this is what we're encountering.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing those mindsets, I guess. I feel like we don't hear a lot about what professors think about mental health on campus, so I really do appreciate both of you answering that. And our time is almost up, so I just wanted to see if either of you had any final points you wanted to say on the topic of mental health. Professor O'Connell Whittet, if you would like to say any final words.
Well, the only thing that is coming to me right now is that I used to think that mental health or mental wellness was like a state that you achieved, and it was going to be a static state once you arrived there. And I would say, from this vantage in my life and in my artistic practice, that it's something that we, never goes away. The desire to be stable and calm and peaceful and all those things that feel really difficult to attain in college are the things that are, the probably the situations in your life will feel slightly more stable and predictable as you age and, settle into whatever career you end up in. But the ways you cope now and think now about your art and your wellness are going to stay with you forever and be really useful to come back to in adulthood, more, not that you're not adults, but in your later adulthood.
I'd like to just reiterate and like encourage everyone to just continue to make for yourself. Find those things, and as much as you can reconnect with making art as just a natural part of our humanity. You know, once we've built the fire, we've gotten the water, we've got the shelter, and now we're going to sit here all bored all winter. What do? Art is what happens, right? So it's a completely fundamental aspect of who we are. We would, to put it in a funny way, given the context, we would go crazy without it, right? And so, uh, yeah, just keep remembering that that's what it is at its core, even as we're doing all of these other endeavors with it. Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up completely, I just wanted to thank both of our panelists once more for taking the time out of their schedules to join us and for providing us with such thoughtful discussion. I think on college campuses especially, mental health awareness should always be brought into the light, and I'm very happy that we did that today. And I think both of your thoughts and opinions shared today will help us all move one step in the right direction. For another reminder, this entire panel is going to be uploaded to the UCSB Humanities and Fine Arts YouTube. So if you know anybody who had to miss the event today, please direct them that way. We also created a video getting student opinions and thoughts on mental health on our UCSB campus. So if you're interested in hearing from some more students, you can find that video on our social media and YouTube channel as well. And to follow all of our various platforms and to stay up to date on future HFA Speaks, you can subscribe to our newsletter and also follow our Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, which is all posted in the chat now by one of our interns. So yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and we hope to see you next time.